All right, so on to part two. So gaining muscle part two, now we're going to get into some different programming strategies. So in part one, we discussed the three mechanisms of building muscle, which are going to be mechanical tension, metabolic stress, and then possibly muscular damage. So now we're going to get into the nitty gritty and talk about some programming considerations. So let's go ahead and get into it. So within those mechanisms, the question usually comes up, well, which one should I focus on? What should be the one that I should put the most time into? So if we look at the different characteristics of mechanical tension and metabolic stress, and then we think about muscular damage kind of being a byproduct of that a little bit, so we'll talk about some of the ins and outs of that later. But if you look at mechanical tension, again, generally speaking, we're thinking of reps being 3 to 5-ish. Again, think heavier type stuff in general. Heavier weights, more sets, probably longer rest periods. The big thing with this is that it's probably going to be a little bit more type 2 dominant. So we look at muscle fibers and type 1 fibers and type 2 fibers. Type 2 fibers are typically going to be the ones that are more responsible for more anaerobic type stuff, more strength and power type activities. So we go on the flip side of the coin and we look at metabolic stress. And with metabolic stress, again, as we discussed earlier, we're looking at higher reps, lighter weights, probably moderate rest periods, and we'll talk about that later as well, but getting near muscular failure. And then we have somewhere in the middle. You know, a lot of times you see, well, the typical hypertrophy range should be between 6 and 12 reps or 8 and 12 reps or something like that. And maybe that's just because you get a little bit of both. You're going to get some mechanical tension, obviously, and then maybe on the later end of that, you're going to get some metabolic stress as well. So in this case, again, it's kind of right in the middle. Moderate weights, moderate amount of sets, still going through a full range of motion. So the answer, well, it just kind of depends, right? And so it depends on the client goals. It depends on what their experience is. It depends on if they have injury or not. And there's a handful of factors that go into it. If someone is not very experienced, then chances are we're probably not going to be working a ton in this mechanical tension range where we're trying to do real heavy stuff with, lower reps. Maybe they're just not ready for it. So maybe for someone who's a beginner, we might start off somewhere here in the middle and then maybe work our way in either direction depending on what we have going on or whatever. So that's just one example of that. Obviously, if someone does have some sort of injury, then same thing. Mechanical tension is probably not going to be in the play because, again, it's heavier weights and maybe the injury wouldn't allow for that person to be able to do that exercise effectively. So if the person is healthy, if the person is ready, I think a good answer is just throw the kitchen sink at it. Maybe you do some things that target mechanical tension. Maybe you do some things that are in the moderate rep range, and then maybe you do some things that specifically target metabolic stress. We talked about type 2 fibers being more dominant in mechanical tension. The good thing about metabolic stress is that we're working both type 1 and type 2 fibers. Early on in the set, we're probably going to be more type 1, and then as we get closer to failure, we're working on type 2, and essentially our whole body is made up of type 1 fibers and type 2 fibers. So the metabolic stress aspect can be beneficial in specifically working type 1 and type 2 and making sure that we're developing muscle fiber growth in both of those. Okay, so here's an example of a study that was recently published, and it looked at the effects of doing 4 rep maxes in training, doing 8 rep maxes in training, and doing 12 rep maxes in training, and how it impacted muscle volume overall. And when it came to overall strength, the sets that had a little bit lower reps and heavier weights was superior, and when it came to overall muscle volume, there wasn't much of a difference between the sets of 4, the sets of 8, and the sets of 12. So that just kind of proves our point to what we were discussing, that if we go back to this, like, hey, stuff works. We can get bigger in here, we can get bigger in here, and we can get bigger in here. Here's another example of that, and now actually looking at metabolic stress in action. And if we have this lower load doing being 3 sets of 25 to 30, which is absolutely brutal, by the way. We look at the muscle gain in this group, and the bicep was 5.3, the tricep was 6.0, the quad was 9.3, and these are going to be percentage gains. And if we look at what it was compared to the higher load group, which was somewhere between 8 and 12 rep max, the only thing that was a big difference was the bicep. But the tricep was pretty similar and the quad was pretty similar. So we can see that by doing high rep type stuff that is getting close to failure, thus working on metabolic stress, that we're still able to get a good amount of muscle gain from that. And then looking down here, again, same thing. We're maybe somewhere in the middle, working a little bit of mechanical tension, working some metabolic stress, and we're still getting some benefits from that. So here's an example of maybe how you might set up a training day. And so if we have this, our split be lower body for this example, the idea behind the way that this is set up is that we want to work across a broad spectrum of reps, right? Because now that we know that, hey, we can still get bigger, in the, maybe 3 to 5 rep range. We can still get bigger in the 8 to 12 rep range, and we can still get bigger in the 15 plus rep range. Because we know that by working lower reps, we're hitting predominantly type 2 fibers. By working a high amount of reps, we're probably hitting both. Okay, so if we have this example, I'll walk you through it a little bit. So in this case, again, we're just looking at lower body type exercises. And so we have the back squat and RDL. We think back squat being more knee dominant, so working a lot of quad and glute. And we have the RDL being more hip dominant, working a lot of glute and hamstring. So in this case, we're thinking, all right, we got, 4 sets of 5, we're targeting mechanical tension. Okay, we got split squat and single leg glute bridge. All right, we have, reps 8 to 10 and still pretty roughly intense in terms of effort, and so we're working somewhere in the middle there. We have a physio ball leg curl and a banded TKE, again hitting hamstrings, hitting quads, and then now we're looking at some higher rep type stuff that's going to target metabolic stress, and then we just have some general accessory work down here that's even going to be at a higher rep range. And with this stuff down here, again, this is looking at the calf. Again, you can substitute another quad or another hamstring type exercise for that, and that's just going to give you some additional growth probably for those specific areas. We can do the same thing and going into upper body where, hey, we got to press, we got to pull, we got to press, we got to pull, we got to press, we got to pull, we got to curl, we got to tricep extension. Again, working across a broad spectrum of reps, going low reps, going moderate to high reps, and then going high reps, we're probably at the point where we're not really leaving any stone unturned. Again, if we work across a broad spectrum, we're going to be targeting the major mechanisms of muscular growth, and that's kind of what we're after. Generally, this is kind of what you're going to see when it comes to suggestions for hypertrophy, right, in a lot of the textbooks and stuff like that. So looking at, goal repetitions being between 6 and 12. But as we just talked about, it all works, right? It's not all that difficult. We can still get bigger in the 3 to 5 rep range. We can still get bigger in the 8 to 12 rep range. We can still get bigger in the 15 plus rep range. And so shout out to Brad Schoenfeld for this graphic. And I think it paints a perfect picture of kind of, what we're after for this. So now you have a decent idea of how to kind of go about programming for muscular hypertrophy. So go ahead and subscribe and check out the next video, and we'll dive into some more programming strategies.